Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And I should tell you that people always applaud before they hear me speak. And then when I stop speaking and walk out, there is a terrible silence. So I thank you for greeting me before the event, and I hope you will not be too disappointed. You deserve to have some reward coming out on this rather sad afternoon. I will do my best for you and also for Tokyo College, where I am making my world debut here for the first time. And of course, I do not want to leave in absolute total silence. So perhaps a token slight applause at the end, not that I'm suggesting it, would be very welcome. Now, if you don't mind, without my showing disrespect, I would like to take my jacket off. And I will do that now. And it's mainly because every time I try to rule and conquer the world, which is what I'm doing this afternoon, I find it very hard, hot work. And I'm one of the few people who knows how President Putin is feeling at the moment as he attempts to do the same thing. If he had telephoned me, I would have told him, keep it to lectures and speeches. Don't try and do it in reality. It won't work. All right, now I have a lot to cover, and I will try not to go too quickly, but at the same time, you need to have some encouragement. So I should be finished in about 45 minutes. I believe the seats are very comfortable. And with your masks on, I cannot see if you are sleeping or not. So please do whatever makes you feel comfortable. What I want to do this afternoon is to give you an interpretation of the evolution of what we call the modern world during the last 3 centuries. My argument joins together 3 terms, the terms in my title: globalization, empires, and modernity, joins them together in a process that has brought us to our very uncertain present. Now, I begin just with a few of the necessary academic qualifications. First of all, please understand there are limits not only to my brain, which are significant, but also to what I can achieve in the time I have allowed myself. And each of these big terms raises such huge questions that we could spend days thinking and discussing them, and you would not thank me for locking the doors and keeping you here that long. The best I can manage in the time I have is to say a word about each of these as we come across them in the course of my talk. And as I shall be tracing this process from a predominantly Western point of view, I should also say, of course, that a full account of this subject should view the changes I have described from a variety of non-Western perspectives. So let me begin with the elements of my story. Everyone knows that globalization is a process that moves people, ideas, goods, money, disease, and environmental change across the world. And we also know in general terms that it has a long history. However, this is the beginning of the story and not its end. So far, strangely though it is, historians have done very little to assist our understanding of the chronology, of the evolution over time of the process we call globalization. We don't know absolutely whether it is a linear process going on, just getting bigger, how many reversals it had, or how many pauses it had. We don't know this. We have lots of generalizations, but historians have not explored these big possibilities in any detail. I want to argue that that globalization occurred in different sequences, one sequence giving rise to another, not being totally eliminated, overlapping with it, but changing in time as the process itself worked out. And each sequence changed because of what can be called a dialectical process, which very simply means that the particular phase of globalization creates opposition and questioning among those who receive the consequences of globalization. And even if the consequences are beneficial, they create new ideas and new social order. The rise of nationalism, for example, in the colonial empire. And so what happens is the process itself begins to create first tensions and then opposition. And when the opposition grows, then one sequence changes to another. So, if I can keep my fingers steady, here we go. I want to suggest that there have been three phases or sequences during the last 300 years. Moreover, to introduce my second term, I shall further argue that in the period down to 1945, the second half of the 20th century, the empires, the Western empires, were the main proponents, agents, impulses in spreading globalization. Of course, they weren't the only ones, but they were, I think, the most important. Familiar examples from the early modern period include Spain, which spread into Latin America, Portugal, which obtained footholds in Brazil, India, and parts of East Asia, the Netherlands, which made claims to Indonesia, and Britain and France, which competed for influence in North America and India. The resulting empires during this period, the 16th, 17th, and into the 18th century, that early modern period, the resulting empires moved goods, people, and ideas to an unprecedented degree. It had not happened on that scale before. Nevertheless, it was an age, as we look back on it, of limited technology and consequently limited achievements. Historians refer to this phase in European history as the phase associated with military fiscal states. Do not panic. It sounds horrendous and complex, but it can be explained quite simply. The Europeans may not have been as good as the Chinese at inventing things, but we were very good in applying them. And above all, we have been historically especially clever at creating the means of destruction. And so the gunpowder revolution, when it spread to Europe and was applied to coercion, to military force, was one of the bases of these emerging states. That is the military component of them. What about the fiscal or the state budgetary aspect of them? Well, of course, this new military consideration required money. It got expensive, both for aggressive purposes and also if you were to defend yourself against this new power. So states had to raise money. How were they going to do it? They only had two ways: tax the peasantry and raise some money from moneylenders. But you see, that was the limitation of state finance. Today, in our great superior wisdom, we don't actually have to pay for anything because we have a national debt and we spread things over a long term. You've heard politicians say, oh, the great-grandchildren are going to have to pay for this. But before the 18th century, that mechanism was not available. Now you can see immediately. You have two things: the expensive military facility and the need to fund it. When those two things are in harmony, you're okay. But if the military expenditure exceeds the revenues, the state is in trouble. And so the concept of a military fiscal state is used to describe the structure and trace the evolution of the great states, Spain, France, and so on, during the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Now, what happened basically was that these states began to run into difficulties as a result of war expenditure in the late 18th century. Remember that we're still in an age before the Industrial Revolution. These are predominantly agricultural states. They have lots of trade, but basically they have limited expectations about economic development. And one of the ways in which they made themselves rich was not by expanding economic growth, but by taking the produce and the taxes from other people. Hence the expansionary impulses of these military fiscal states. So they were more predatory than they were productive. Think for a minute of the great long-distance products of the period. Sugar, spices, gold, and silver were produced mainly by extractive means, and particularly, as we all know, most notoriously, the Atlantic slave trade. Now, these states, as I hinted, entered what we now see to be a terminal crisis at the end of the 18th century. Two major revolutions: the revolution of the mainland colonies, which became the United States, began in 1776, and then, related to it, the French Revolution of 1789. Now, I'm not saying that fiscal problems, the budgetary deficit, was the sole cause of these enormous movements. Of course not. I am saying that you cannot explain them fully without having this element in place. So what happened then, of course, in France was the Great Revolution of 1789, and the consequences of that, the causes of that were basically because, as I've said, the fiscal capacity of the state was incapable of meeting its expenditure. Only one state, my own, Britain, had cracked this problem. The British invented the national debt in 1694. Bingo! They had a credit card for the state. They had found a means of funding expenditure over the longer term. Other states did not have that. And that's just one of the reasons why the British were able to survive the 18th century without a revolution. Well, the upheaval that followed with all of the French wars in the 1790s through to the defeat of Napoleon in 1815 really brought proto-globalisation, this phase that I have been describing, to its terminal point. It did not end immediately. Napoleon's defeat in 1815 was, to be sure, a significant event. But the sequencing did not just complete itself at that point. The military victory was actually, Napoleon's defeat, the victory of the Allies, was followed by a long struggle between the victorious Allies led by monarchical Britain, who wanted, rather like the United States after 1945, to establish a stable set of governments on the continent, preferably kings and queens, if not a republic of a conservative kind. That is what the British were trying to do from 1815. So what you have in the 19th century, throughout the 19th century, is not a smooth transition from the old military fiscal state to the new liberal welfare state, but a protracted struggle between conservatives and reformers to see which was going to prevail. And as I have suggested elsewhere, although this discussion is confined largely to Europe, it can be extended to include the United States, because although the United States became independent in 1783, it was only formally independent. In practical terms, the United States remained very strongly dependent on Britain for its economy, for its culture, and so on. And more than that, the United States during this period was ruled basically by a combination of southern slave-holding states, and they created an alliance with Britain. So what you have is this conflict between conservatives and progressives taking place on a wider scale than is generally recognized. That is one omission. A second omission is even greater than that because it deals with Europe itself. You see, we historians like to have compartments. We feel comfortable within our speciality. That's for other people. United States independent in 1783. Forget that, that's not imperial history any longer. That's for the national story. I'm trying to suggest to you that's not the case. Similarly, in Europe, what we have there is European history. But listen for a minute as what was happening in Europe, and you will see that what you have there in the 19th century is an anticipation of the colonial expansion that we associate with Britain and France at the end of the 19th century. Napoleon had himself crowned as emperor in 1804. He created an empire throughout Europe. He established forms of government of the kind that were later set up in Africa and parts of Asia. In managing his conquered territories, the emperor and his advisors distinguished between incorporated states, satellites, and allies. They sought collaborators, a term well known to historians of empire. They applied techniques of direct and indirect rule. They reformed existing legal systems, just what the European empires in the rest of the world were going to do later. Moreover, his imperial representatives showed an acute awareness of the power of symbolism in art, in architecture, in styles and public displays, and demonstrated to their own satisfaction the matchless superiority of their own culture. And they also had to deal with what they called resistance and insurgents, modern-sounding terms, in fact, from the French of the late 18th century. And they created paramilitary units to control disaffected elements. And so you have with Napoleon not only an imperial cult, but also an imperial structure throughout Europe, which, as I've said, is well known to historians of Europe, but not mentioned to historians of empire. So the French built this empire. More than that, they were the authors of the first decolonizing movements in Europe itself. So what we have in the late 18th and early 19th century is the first decolonizing movement, great decolonizing movement, taking place as the military fiscal states and their empires began to crumble. We all know of the independence of the republics of South America and so on. We don't add to them the anti-colonial movements in Europe, which led, for example, eventually to the German states coming together and under the leadership of Prussia, forming Germany in 1871. So what you have is a much bigger story of the end of this first phase of imperial globalization beyond the formal textbook assessments of the end of these early empires. So the transition then to what I'm terming modern globalization took place in the 19th century, but not immediately or abruptly. There was this long struggle, as I have said, between conservatives and reformers, which went on through the 19th century. Of course, we want to put a date to it, and it's very difficult for the reasons I've given. But I'll give you a date. Roughly speaking, the 1860s can be identified as a turning point away from one form of military fiscal globalization and another which I'm terming modern globalizations. And through this political instability and economic uncertainty, modern globalization and modern nation states emerged. What we have then, out of this turmoil during the second half of the 19th century, were the emergence of the two key features of the modern world. You know them already: industrialization and the rise of the nation state to replace the old dynastic states. Of course, it didn't happen immediately. The Spanish was still having difficulties, so too the Italians, Austro-Hungarian, and Russia, of course. 1914 put an end to all of those uncertainties. But for other states, France and Germany, big states in Europe, and the Nordic countries, these changes were taking place, and so they were taking place in the United States. The 1860s then saw the emergence of national unity, beginnings of it, emergence of a nation state in Germany 1870, in Italy 1870, reforms even in Austro-Hungary, reforms of a progressive time in France, in the Netherlands, in Scandinavia, and in Japan, all in the 1860s. And that is also the decade that sees the big development, the noticeable development of industrialization. Of course, it all has small beginnings earlier in the 19th century, but it's in the 1870s that the first industrial nation, Great Britain, began to have important foreign rivals in Germany and the United States. In the 1870s, they were not just producing manufactures for themselves, but also exporting them. Now, these two enormous changes, the development of nation states, the creation of an industrial world, just mentioning them alone ought to alert you to the tremendous upheaval that this involved. It was protracted. It was marked by new conflicts, not between a landed elite and the peasantry or among the landed elite, but for the first time between capital and labor. Agricultural society was being transformed into urban society. As that happened, new social groups were coming to the fore. So this presented enormous challenges to the landed elite. The political battles of the late 19th century were centered on that question: who was going to rule these new style states, states which we are familiar with in our own time, of course. Moreover, as these changes were taking place, this new international economy, much more based on the exchange of manufactured, mass-produced, machine-produced commodities, accompanied, especially in Britain, but in France to a degree too, accompanied by huge flows of overseas investment that were unprecedented in their scale and their reach. This was a new international order. And it also had its fluctuations and its difficulties. And in the late 19th century, there was a period of, well, deflation, where growth faltered, and these problems were transmitted to a society that was just beginning to create these new uncertain social groups in towns. You can see that if you were a ruler at that time, you would have a permanent headache as to how to manage all of this. And you would be right to be worried, because this was a time, as I have mentioned, of urban protests, riots, the beginnings of trade unions, and also of rural distress, which formed one of the first waves of populism, a phrase that we use today, but has its origins, not its origins, but at least its major expression in the late 19th century, both in Europe and in the United States. So these pressures tested the unity of the infant nation states. What was happening in the creation of nation states can be summarized in this way. These new states were trying to forge a new sense of unity. The contract was not between a dynasty and its following, and its alliance with other landowners and their peasants responding. The new alliance was between a new kind of elite, often urban-based elites, and they had to strike an alliance that would affiliate the population not to a dynasty, not to an inherited crowned king, but to the state itself, so that politicians would turn around, but the affiliation, the loyalty to the state would persist. So we can say that warfare states of the old kind were being supplemented by welfare states. The contract was like this: if you, the people, give us, the representatives of the state, your loyalty, we will give you protection and perhaps some welfare benefits as well. And in exchange for that, the contract is sealed, because we will give you some rights of voting. It had not happened before. So you have voting rights, the world we are familiar with, but in exchange you have to pay taxes. So that was the nature of the new social contract that began to be formed in the late 19th century. Well, as you can see, these pressures tested the unity of these emerging nation states. Politicians faced a really difficult problem of maintaining a civil order and social cohesion. So what did they do? They went through the normal range of things: concessions, if they could afford them, repression, yes, and occasionally welfare reform, in Germany leading the way, for example. And they also turned to assertive imperialism as a way of giving the new population a stake above the provinces, above their local loyalties, in what this new nation was doing. Now, of course, the motives varied considerably. There was a great competition between the big powers to annex parts of the world in the late 19th century. Nearly every developing state acquired other people's territory. And the states, here is an irony, the states of continental Europe, which had freed themselves, remember, from Napoleon, were among the first to start to colonize others, as the United States, having freed itself from Britain, was colonizing, in a sense, Native Americans and subsequently islands in the Pacific and Caribbean. So during this period, without entering into details, most of the world was covered, of course with exceptions, either with direct rule, or say in the case of the Ottoman Empire and China, by a form of informal influence which hampered the independence of the existing state as a result of the expansion of these powers. Some, like Britain, were motivated predominantly by economic motives. Britain already had a very secure national unity and an advanced economy. Britain had particular incentives or motives in creating markets and established recipients for its flows of finance from the City of London. Other states were just beginning, like Italy, for instance. Italy was not even united until the beginnings of the 1870s. There wasn't an Italian language. Some people in Lombardy could not understand people in Sicily. Language, as we found yesterday in our fascinating discussion with some of you informally about your work, language is the key to unity of a country. And so these were serious problems for a country like Italy, which is only just beginning to industrialize. So in the case of countries like that, the political motive was uppermost. The idea that the new great Italian nation could have colonies just like Britain and France. So by 1914, not even the penguins of Antarctica were free from the claims of the major powers. Remember, these modern states had a penetrative capacity. They had steamships, they had railways, they had the Maxim gun. One person with a machine gun could control hundreds, if not thousands. So the ratios had changed. It was easier for such advanced states to extend their influence. And they were accompanied to their own satisfaction by a sense of superiority. Something called scientific racism developed in the late 19th century, so that we Europeans were quite satisfied with an objective academic analysis which placed us at the top of the racial hierarchy. It seemed very satisfactory, especially if you were British, because of course the British stood above other people, and if you lived in London in particular, you stood above everyone else. So this complex hierarchy of superiority, which provided a validation, it legitimized the rule of some people over others. So you put all of this together and you have an imperial ethos, an imperial idealism. There then followed half a century of colonial rule in which all the imperial powers were obliged to develop their colonies, either for the resource materials or because they got landed with something that was going to be very expensive, very poor, unless they put money into it. So one way or another, they were committed. And these aims of developing these colonies could not be undertaken without limiting the sovereignty of independent states, because you needed to build railways, you needed to mobilize a labor force, you needed to ensure that local polities did not have the independence to resist what you wanted to do. So here is a key point. If you can still bear to hear my voice, don't worry. I won't tell you we're at the conclusion just yet, but it's on the horizon, and the horizon isn't so far away. So what happened then was that the export crops and minerals flowed to the international economy, consumer goods made the return, and the whole enterprise was justified by the notion of the civilizing mission which we, the superior people, were delivering to the rest of the world. Well, what happened to this huge global experiment? As you know, because now we're coming down rapidly almost to your time, not quite. You weren't even a twinkle in anyone's eye when we get to the end of World War II. I can remember it, unfortunately. After World War II, the Western empires fell apart as fast as they had been put together in the 19th century. India became independent in 1947, others followed. By the 1960s, the whole of Africa was more or less independent. There were few places that were left to be decolonized. And so the ambitions and confident predictions of the ruling powers, they were going to be there to civilize. Of course, it would take time, but we would be persistent and succeed in the end. Those aspirations were terminated, and a new set of aspirations and ambitions were taken over by the first generation of independent rulers. The process of decolonization, this is the second great decolonization. Remember the first one, 1800s, with Latin America, but also with European involvement and with the United States being decolonized, but not completely. That process was much bigger than we have understood it to be. So too, after 1945, we come to the second great decolonization. And that too was much bigger than even considering Asia and Africa, huge though they are. And I'm calling this post-colonial globalization a phase that began, a third phase that began after 1945 and is still with us today. Remember that the expansion of the Western empires from the 1850s to 1950s had been driven by nationalism and industrialization. The type of globalization these developments required was specific to the needs of the time. It was designed to support the nation states and to encourage the development of their manufactures. After 1945, these forces no longer operated in the same way or to the same degree. Modern globalization was gradually being superseded by a new sequence or phase of globalization. The main characteristics of this third phase can be summarized in the following way. Firstly, the international economy began to move away from this classic colonial exchange of raw materials for consumer goods. By 1955, the post-war recovery, as you well know in Japan, the post-war recovery was well underway. The developed colonies began to trade increasingly among themselves, beginning with the trio of Europe, North America, and Japan. Consequently, colonial trade, though continuing, became less important. The trend was much more towards intra-industry trade. That is, the industries of the developed countries trading among themselves rather than the old colonial exchange of manufacturers in the West going for raw materials from the other countries in the so-called Third World. New regional associations sprang up to represent these new trends. So what we have, of course, is the common market. The European Union is one. And today, Australia, New Zealand trade increasingly with China, Japan, and Indonesia. And East Asia now produces more than 1/4 of world exports of manufactures. I cite that example just to indicate the extent of the change from the old colonial days. The trio, the triad as it was called, Europe, North America, and Japan, soon became a quartet and is now a whole orchestra in which China blows the loudest trumpet. So the economy changed. Next, the notion of racial supremacy that had underpinned claims to Western supremacy came under increasing attack. After 1945, the victorious powers felt obliged to advertise a new formulation of human rights as part of a New Deal. This was intended to extend the life of the empires, not to end them, to extend it by offering the colonial subjects a reformed, better empire. Unfortunately for the colonial rulers, this idea was received by nationalists with some acclaim, and they began to use this notion of universal human rights against colonial powers and against their colonial rulers. And so this development began from the 50s, a shift in the economy, a shift in culture, and thirdly, a shift in the international political order. A political order that for the first time was both multicultural and multi-centric. The Bandung Conference of 1955 startled the Western powers by creating a non-aligned movement led by India, Indonesia, and China. The steady accession of new members to the United Nations tilted the balance away from the Big Four, even though they still controlled the Security Council. The colonial powers found themselves on the defensive. During the Cold War, they were obliged to bid for support from their former colonies if they were to win the hearts and minds of newly independent countries. It was a stunning reversal of fortune. Now, I have emphasized earlier the role of the intellectual change involved in the rise of human rights. And I want to just have a word about that, because it's hard to measure and it's easy to exaggerate, but it's easier still to underestimate. I am guilty for doing this in the past, by the way. This was a fundamental revolution in human history. Just as the late 19th century saw a transformation in world history as economy and politics moved from the land to the town, so too, after 1945 and gathering pace, the notion of universal human rights was one that is so significant we almost take it for granted. It was indeed a revolution. Of course, there's more talk than action in this field, but this should not hide the fact that our reactions to famine, war, and exploitation across the world have changed significantly. It's not only that we can see terrible events on our television screens, whether we wish to or not. It's also that we care more about them than we used to do in distant times when we took it for granted. We may not all know it, and some people may not like it, but in this respect, we have all been converted to the thinking of the great Enlightenment philosophe of the 18th century. So changes to the economy, changes to the idea of racial supremacy and human rights, and changes in the makeup of the international political order. These three things were decisive changes justifying a shift in the sequence of globalization from modern, what I'm calling modern, to what I'm calling post-independent globalization. And if we do this, just as in the early 19th century, we could include in the story Europe, you remember, and the United States, so too, if we take this broader view of decolonization, that it was not only a matter of the interaction between colonial policy and nationalism, colonial nationalism, but it had this wider context, we can see that other countries that are currently excluded from consideration can be brought into the story. So, the so-called white empire of Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they're left out of this story. Why? Because they had achieved already home rule, local self-government. But that was nothing like effective independence. Right through to the 1950s, these countries too were effectively under colonial rule. Their economies were related still to that of the home country. Their culture was dependent on that of Britain. Their political leaders deferred to Westminster and to the Crown. It was only from the 1970s that these countries began to assert themselves in those fields and become as independent as we know they are today. And the other omission from this story of decolonization after 1945 is the United States. What was happening there? It's true that the United States' formal empire was very small. Some islands in the Caribbean, well, Philippines in the Pacific is rather big, but the Hawaii and Philippines. But these are omitted completely from the story of decolonization. Yet they were created in 1898 when the other powers created their big empires. They were ruled through the first half of the 20th century much the same way, with much the same racial assumptions, much the same colonial economic exchanges, very, very similar. And finally, they were decolonized after World War II at exactly the same time. The Philippines got independence in 1946, and the others altered their status through to the incorporation of Hawaii in as a state of the federal union, federal government of the United States in 1959. Exactly the same timing as the great European powers. You won't read this in any of the books on imperial history. You hear it now, I give it to you free of charge. Well, I mentioned finally, but the good news is never believe an academic's finally. You know, we academics allow several of these. But please cheer up. I am now coming to what passes for a conclusion. So as I have described it, decolonization after World War II, the second great decolonization, was not just one more major episode in the long history of Western empires, but an event that marked their final demise. The age of great territorial empires ended in the 1960s. They had lost their purpose. They had lost their legitimacy. They had ceased to be acceptable ways of integrating or managing the world, and they were no longer relevant to the needs of post-colonial globalization that shape the international order today. Large, powerful states that conduct much of the world's trade and finance cannot contemplate colonizing one another. Even if they had the ambition, the task would be so formidable as to be impracticable. Moreover, power has drained from the former colonial states. To adapt an old saying, when China sneezes, it is the West that catches a cold. The settlers of the 21st century are not whites going to distant parts of the world, but former colonial subjects who are, in a sense, striking back or colonizing the former colonial power. Great powers find it hard, almost impossible, to accept that they have passed their zenith, passed their peak. The United States did not learn the lessons of Vietnam despite defeat, and added other catastrophes in Iraq and Afghanistan. Britain has turned imperial nostalgia into electoral appeal. President Putin may see himself as Emperor Putin, but his attempted recolonization of Ukraine ignores the fact that in an era of self-determination and human rights, an era of post-colonial globalization, citizens of other countries resent having their land occupied by a foreign power. The age of great empires has passed, The age of illusion that follows will eventually dissolve when unpalatable realities can no longer be avoided. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Hopkins, for this fascinating romp through world history and the history of globalization and empires. And I mainly wanted to make a comment about two things, or asking kind of two questions for you, to give you an opportunity to expand on some of the subjects that you touched that you obviously, because of the time, couldn't talk more about. So the first one would be about some aspects of the story that you've been telling, and the second would be about the enduring impact of empire. So let me start first. So the focus of your storyline was on Western empires in the history of globalization since the 18th century. And at the beginning you said, of course, like there are different perspectives to be talked about. There are like perspectives of other countries and other parts of the world. So I wanted to ask a bit more about like how you contextualize the story that you told today. For example, like the issue of non-Western agency is something that has been discussed in global history. So I wonder what your perspective is on how these other parts of the world would fit in your narrative if you had to somehow add them to make this perspective more global. For one example, since we're in Japan, would be about the Japanese Empire and its early modern history, early modern prehistory. Is it kind of, does it follow the same pattern? Or is it kind of an add-on, or is it just, in your perspective, does it have agency, or did it react to like other parts, not just Japanese, but other parts of the world? Do they react? I mean, you have been working on West African history yourself, right? So you have these other perspectives. I just wondered if you could expand on them a bit. But also, depending on the time and what you find most interesting, what I'm saying here, also the American Empire, you wrote that book recently about the American Empire. You touched a bit on it, so how does it relate? Like, is it also an expansion or like on the same kind of developmental line as European empires, or does it have its own trajectory in some way? How does it fit into this really global story? And since I have been also a bit working on the early modern period, I wondered also, for example, in other accounts, so your own periodization is mostly like starting in the 18th century, you have these three periods of like proto-globalization, and then like basically that of formal colonies, and then the post-colonial empires. Victor Lieberman has written, for example, from a different perspective, saying that this is all not just a European phenomenon or like about the spread of European empires, but it's actually something that happened across Eurasia, right? It's kind of a pattern that happened in Eurasia. So I just wondered if you see this as, it's a differing story. It's not oppositional to yours, but I just wondered like if you could relate yours to these kind of accounts. Or another one would be by Charles Parker, was 2010, about global interactions in the early modern age, when he was talking about a reinterpretation of the early modern period from a global perspective, from that Eurocentric age of discovery where Europeans spread across the world to an era of empire building, and like that cross-cultural interaction that also affected Europe in many regards. That would be the first one. And the second one would be at the other end of your story or your periodization, where you talked at the end about the final demise of empire. So I wondered if you could talk a bit more about which role do you think, like final demise sounds to me quite strong. I totally see obviously what you mean in terms of colonies and form of territorial empires of the 19th century. That period seems to be completely over. But you talked about other forms of empire as well, like informal empires, different forms of influence that exert strong control over other countries, finances, populations, trade, and so on, that could be seen and belong to some broader pattern of imperial power, perhaps. So for the USA, like people have been talking about the empire of bases, for example, right? In 1945, there were 2,000 bases around the world, American bases. In 1991, there were 1,600. Today, it's still 800 bases in other countries of the world, which is completely unthinkable for other countries having a military base in the United States, right? It's a form even of territorial or exterritoriality and so on. There are also like exterritorial economic zones, which are not necessarily controlled by countries, but where basically big corporations exert some form of governmentality that are connected to national economic interests and so on. But also the role of foundations, if we talk about America, like the Rockefeller Foundation, the role of religions like evangelicalism, if we just talk about the American case, right, or the global dominance of US tech companies, and all these different forms of soft power and sharp power, perhaps, that go beyond the traditional or historical forms of empire. And of course, I mean, from the perspective of many indigenous groups, contemporary empires also can be thought to be very real. Like, for example, there was this case in British Columbia some years ago where members of the Wet'suwet'en Nation argued that their territory was never ceded, so why is it possible that the Canadian government can build a pipeline through their territory, right? So they even make these historical claims about, like, that colonialism hasn't ended and this is a form of control of territory that does not belong properly to the Canadian state. And that's, of course, happening in all like in many areas of the world. Or, like, to give another example of, like, the Chinese influence, the Belt and Road Initiative, right? I'm thinking about patterns of, like, how empire is still like imperial forms of or neo-imperial forms of control are still happening, right? So these large-scale infrastructure projects across Eurasia that like bind countries to spheres of influence of big powers. These are just some examples. I just wanted to hear you, like, talk about that more and what you think about it. Thank you very much.
My name is Hung Yin. I'm a postdoc at Tokyo College here. I'm very delighted to be here today. Well, although my title today is a commentator, I'm not probably going to make comment just like Mikhail. I will have, like, probably more questions and comments just like Mikhail, that I would like to contextualize this talk further to trigger more conversation for historian and non-historian, since we have such a diverse and fantastic audience today. I would like to thank Professor Hopkins again for giving us such fascinating talk, that you took us to travel so, like, hundreds of years across so many different empires, that you divided history into two phases of globalization by different modes of economic production and consumption and different kind of political institution, and show how our current world come from this history. And but in these three phases, I noticed that you argue that the United States is missing or underrepresented in our current historical consideration of empire. So this question might echo Mikhail's question. So I was wondering why you trying to bring the U.S. back to our consideration of imperial history. And if we got U.S. back to this history, what and how will our idea of U.S. change because of this? Because you make this argument in at least two parts. One is that United States should be an example of a former colony influenced by its former colonizer after 1783, and the other is the United States should be taken into consideration in the decolonization for its control over its American control islands. So yeah, I'm wondering why you kind of have this idea to argue against American exceptionalism and how it shaped our current idea of American. I'm also curious what you think about modernity, because the whole talk for me feels like you're talking about modernity without mentioning modernity. Without mentioning modernity. Instead you use the term modern world or like modern globalization. So I was wondering, do you think modernity today inherently included modern globalization, or what's the connection between modern globalization and modernity? So my last question goes slightly beyond our talk today, but it's a big thing here in Japan. So this year actually is exactly the last month. the high school history education in Japan fundamentally reorganized to integrate Japanese history with global history. And many of you may have heard that the global history is an emerging trade in historical research and education. But some people argue that the global history is the rebranded imperial history because global history focuses a lot on empires. So I was wondering what you think about the difference between the kind of somehow old-fashioned imperial history and this really emerged global history. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for those admirable, unanswerable questions. I said yesterday that one of the great things of getting old as a scholar is that you no longer feel you have to answer every question or else be thought to be stupid. I know that I can't answer every question, but I thank you for asking them. And also I bear in mind that the audience has been very patient so far, and I will try to not intrude further on your time. I can't do justice to these comments. It would take weeks and weeks, but I will try just to hit a few points to indicate how I would look at this. So how does Japan fit in? Well, of course, I don't know, but I know enough of the literature to indicate that from the beginning of the so-called two island empires at the turn of the century, the Anglo-Japanese alliance, the reforms of 1869 and the rapid development of manufacturing, the defeat of Russia in 1905, Japan was following in its Asian-Japanese way, a trajectory that is in outline quite familiar to the sort of story I'm telling in the West. And then it continues, as you very well know, with Japan expansionism, accompanied, of course, by the East Asian co-prosperity sphere, which gave great hope to many people in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, but actually turned out to be another, how can I put this delicately, device for establishing Japanese superiority. So from my beginning on this, which may well be far too out of date, would be to begin with the hypothesis that the Japanese story from the 1860s does actually fit, at least in outline, and can be added to the Western story. And then, of course, all Japanese specialists will say, oh, well, that's too crude, and it probably is. The USA, there's several questions about the USA, which all I can tell you to do, objectively speaking, is to buy my book on American Empire. I can assure you that you will not get better value for about $20, and it's there that I argue many of the points that I put very crudely this afternoon, and which I, of course, have, I hope, more space to justify, but particularly the notion of exceptionalism. I'm not the only person to attack this idea. There's a difference between being distinctive and being exceptional. All countries believe that they are distinctive, and they are, otherwise they wouldn't be their own country, okay? But exceptionalism makes a higher claim. It's the idea that a country is not just different from others, but that it has a special mission from on high. And that goes along with the belief in certain superior qualities. Now, that argument has been put by the British, by the French, by the Germans, by the Russians, and I believe there is even a Japanese version of exceptionalism. It's not confined to the United States, so the United States doesn't know about these other exceptionalisms and believes that it is exceptional. Well, that belief is ingrained in the United States population, but it is not something that scholars of the US really credit any longer. And so I have developed an argument along those lines, not by refusing to accept the distinctiveness of the United States, but by suggesting that its broad trajectory is indeed recognizable in the trends that I have outlined. Early modern, Victor Lieberman and so on. Yes, well, I am at the limits of my own knowledge as to how to extend my argument or modify it, so I can't comment usefully on that, except, I know Lieberman's work, of course, except to say that I hope some of you here may be able to answer that question yourselves with superior linguistic and literary skills, and I think it would be fantastic eventually to be able to either merge these literatures or see more clearly a real distinction and not just different stereotypes that we have inherited. Yes, and several questions, good questions, dealt with the period after decolonization. What about those 2,000 bases that the US has all over the place? Yes. Be careful, though. My definition of empire, which I underlined, was that it was strongly territorial. You had to have possession of territory comprehensively to prevent the local authority from having independence so they wouldn't oppose you, to have the ability to put through and finance railways, etc., etc., and to extract the raw materials that were required. So these modern empires were territorial. The US bases are not like that at all. The US doesn't wish to integrate these places. On the contrary, it's quite happy to keep them at a distance while using them as bases for defensive, aggressive purposes. Now, scholars in the US will throw the word empire around, but historians of empire are really rather careful about this, because we know that you cannot define the term for eternity. The term is malleable, it changes as circumstances change. And this has been well known since classical Greek and Roman times. The term has varied. So it's foolish to look for one term that will apply to everything. Hence, my distinction between the proto-global empires, which were not, well, I won't go into that, and the modern empires which had this penetrative capacity and the need to integrate. Now, if you come to the US, here is the difficulty. It's easy to confuse categories. No one would deny that the US is anything other than a major power with all of these bases and the biggest military in the world. All of that is true. But if you call it an empire, as if that will do, if it's an important major power, it's an empire, then think of the confusion that you are adding to. You are suggesting, implying that the United States, with its bases, if you call it an empire, it can be compared to Britain, France, and so on in the period 1850, 1950, or Spain before then. These were entirely different animals. We are in a different era. If you call it an empire, you're going to have to define it as such and make sure that you don't slip into comparisons. When the United States invaded Iraq in March 2003, books were produced overnight with all of these historical comparisons. And the classics were called upon. There was even a classical scholar hired by the Pentagon to advise on whether Greece and Rome had anything to do with what was going on in Iraq, which of course they didn't. I could have told them that for half the price, but they didn't ask me. So you have to be very careful in using these terms. It's why I defined my terms and why I suggested that in those terms, it was very difficult to see empires of that kind, as far as we can see, recovering. If you'd say to me, oh, but there are major powers and there are businesses with lots of influence, of course. But if you're going to call them empires, be careful, because you will slip into making comparisons with Greece, Rome, Portugal, Venice, Britain, France, and then you are putting together too much variety. So the result of that, I think, is confusion. Now, what else? Ah, yes. Actually, just one more point on this. If you look at the literature on these business groups, these multinational, transnational corporations, and you have the image of this central power determining everything, well, no. The studies that have been done, particularly on Latin America, show that these transnationals is a better word, transnational corporations go local. They become house-trained. They sink so much capital into wherever it is that they have to take care of local politicians. They have to take care of the labor force, etc. So when Chicago or whoever it is says, hey, we want you to do this, the local boss says, well, wait a minute, we can't do that because we're going to offend politician A and we're going to have the labor unions causing a lot of trouble. So in a way, the localization of global business empires does not make them simply tools of the center, but it creates a semi-independent force. I throw that in as just a piece of nuance and sophistication to say that this question of business imperialism has to be thought through very well. As for the First Nations, yes, that's a very good point about Canada and elsewhere. You've got the Maori in New Zealand, the Inuit, the Innu, who I have studied the Innu in Labrador. In Canada, you have the Ainu, and you have the Sami, formerly Laplanders in northern Scandinavia and Russia, and so on. And you're right, these are people who have at various times had a very rough deal of a kind which you can call colonial. But what's happened now? They too have been affected by what you might call a decolonizing ethos. From the 1870s, the Maori have recovered many of their lands. This is the big dispute in Canada today. So across the world, you will find that although these first peoples, as they are referred to, are indeed still in difficulties, some of them in huge difficulties, there is also a growing recognition from the human rights revolution that I referred to that they need a better deal. I don't think for a moment that global history and imperial history, I'm not sure I can comment really usefully on anything else without spending a lot of time on it, and I don't think that's fair to you, even though I'm going to be unfair to the speakers whose excellent comments deserve much more time than I am giving at the moment. So I think we need a British compromise, and I think the sensible thing is probably for me to stop with apologies right at this moment and thank everybody for your patience.